we are very excited to have one of the luminary scholars in the entire field of Middle East studies, and certainly perhaps the scholar of Jordan, Professor Jillian Schwedler. I will read a little bit of Dr. Schwedler's accomplishments. Dr. Jillian Schwedler is professor of political science at the City University of New York's Hunter College, and the Graduate Center and non-resident senior fellow at the Crown Center at Brandeis University. She has served as chair of the board of directors and member of the Editorial Committee of the Middle East Research and Information Project, MERIP, which is a fantastic publication that's been around for almost 50 years. And they publish the quarterly Middle East report. Dr. Schwedler's research currently focuses on contentious politics and political geography, particularly concerning protests in urban and peri-urban settings. Her books include the award-winning Faith in Moderation, Islamist Parties in Jordan and Yemen in 2006, and with Laleh Khalili, Policing and Prisons in the Middle East in 2010. Her articles have appeared in World Politics, Comparative Politics, Middle East Policy, Middle East Report, Middle East Critique, Journal of Democracy, and Social Movement Studies, among many others, and I can attest to that. Her most recent books are Protesting Jordan, which is the book we are addressing today, Geographies of Power and Dissent, Stanford University Press 2022, very hot off the press, and The Political Science of the Middle East, Theory and Research Since the Arab Uprisings. Author and co-editor with Marc, Lynch as well, and Sean Yom, Oxford University Press, also in 2022, which is a remarkable volume as well. We are delighted to have you, Jillian. I cannot stop talking about your contributions to the field and also to the community beyond the scholarly field. So I'm very excited that you are here, and we are looking forward to hearing from you. I also want to say that you and I also produced a
special symposium.
Symposium in the Political Science APSA publication, which was remarkable, and it actually addressed some of the material that we all discuss when we talk about the uprisings. I will welcome you again and leave the floor to you. I'll be sitting in the back, so you won't see me.
I'm not sure that will be the case, that I won't see. Thank you so much for that incredibly generous introduction, and I'm super, super happy to be here, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my book. It's a book on protests in Jordan from the 19th century through the pandemic, but I'm really striving not just to be a detailed look at Jordan, but to ask some big questions for political science, political economy, so it's intended to have a broader reach. So I'll ask you at the end in particular, besides just questions that you might have for me, what this made you think of. Because I'm going to look at it more broadly and produce an article that examines some of these issues comparatively, and so I'd love to hear the kinds of things that come to your mind as you're hearing me talk about my work. What's interesting about Jordan is a case that's it's a non-democratic country that has hundreds and sometimes thousands of protests a year. In fact, there's so many, most of them aren't disruptive, that when you talk to Jordanians, they'll say there's not that many protests in Jordan. It's going to be a short book. But in fact, there's hundreds every year. There's labor strikes, there's sit-ins, there are very localized specific issues all across the country. Shortage of water, there's not enough water in the country, blocking roads. We don't have a cell phone tower in our neighborhood. We want a cell phone tower. So there's all kinds of localized protests. And like places like Washington, D.C., you might not even be aware of a protest unless you're in the immediate vicinity. And that's an interesting case in terms of a non-democratic case. I ask some really large questions that have broad reach beyond my case. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them here, but I just want to give you a sense of some of the scope. First, I'm asking, what role do protests play in challenging but also reproducing state power? We tend to think of protests as contentious events that are, critiquing those in power, demanding changes, and yet I try to show that sometimes protests can actually help reproduce state powers, and that's one of the issues that I'm going to draw out today. Similarly, why do protests emerge in particular locations where they do and take the form that they do? And why does repression vary? So I'll show you an instance of protests around the same issue, and in one location there's thousands of people that are left alone, and in a very nearby location there's a few dozen people that are beaten by the riot police. So what explains that? What are the political effects of routine protests? So this is something I'm also going to talk about today. Protests that take place, they're so routine they're almost boring. Sort of, you meet here and the police go here and then you stand here and after 3 hours everybody's going to go home. And it's the same thing over and over and over. So how are we to make sense of routine protests like that? What is accomplished for the protesters? What is accomplished for the state? And the last one, which I'll talk about only briefly because there's too much in the book to talk about in one 40-minute talk, but I really look at the sort of, this is the IR, international relations, component of the project. And that is, you can't just look at what's happening inside Jordan as a state that's sort of hermetically sealed and has domestic politics. We have to think about regional and global financial interactions, security arrangements, trading partners, I have a section in the book talking about training each other's police forces on techniques for repressing protest and counterterrorism. So we need to sort of bring all these things into view to understand what's happening in Jordan and also how those protests shape things outside of Jordan themselves. My definition of protest is a really broad one. I'm simply looking at claims making in public spaces against some authority. So very often it's the state or proto-state powers, or the Ottoman colonial powers, but it could be against some other power holder as well. This really broad definition allows me to have an expansive view of what protests are. So I can include all manner of acts of rebellion and revolt that happened prior to the state-making period under the Ottomans. This is an image of the Bedouin repairing the Hejaz Railroad with the Bedouin, keep tearing it up because the Bedouin are losing their pilgrimage routes, where they're taking caravans, pilgrimage and trade and making money for it, transiting people north to south, and the railroad is making that income go away. So their answer is to just keep tearing up the railroad, and then they have to use the Bedouin caravans in the interim. Burning government buildings, blocking roads, disrupting transit, sabotaging infrastructure. Most of these things continue up until today. But also, of course, I look at very conventional forms of protests, demonstrations, sit-ins, marches of the kind that are familiar to us. And I said, well, as I mentioned, one of the things that's most interesting about Jordan is with all these protests, you seldom have people die in protest. The government doesn't fire live ammunition into a crowd. People have died in protests. They've died in student protests. They've died in other protests, but not on the scale that you see in many other non-democratic countries. There's no Rabaa massacre. There's no square where dozens or even hundreds of people were killed. This simply doesn't exist in Jordan. The only sites of massacres were ones that the British Air Force bombed people that were protesting in the state-making period. But in the contemporary period, you simply don't have them. That doesn't mean there's not a lot of security presence. This is a photograph I took at a protest, anti-gas deal with Jordan protest. With Israel. So Jordan made a gas deal with Israel, and this is a protest against that deal. And there's about 50 people here, and there's about 300 or 400 police officers. And what's interesting about this particular picture is there's 4 different sectors of security forces all lined up one against each other. And they surround the protesters on 3 sides. One side is exposed. So you have this very heavy presence. And I'll talk also about the other techniques the government uses to try to intimidate activists from protesting in the first place, punish them for protesting, prevent them from getting to protest sites, make protest sites hard to access, make them less visible. All these techniques that are used to try to prevent protests. So while you have protests, it's not that the government's happy about them, right? And so you have this sort of struggle between protesters and activists about claiming public space. So I'm making 3 main theoretical interventions in the book, which I'll summarize briefly, and then I'm going to spend most of my talk just illustrating them. So sort of 3 empirical illustrations, so you can make these abstract theoretical points much more tangible and hopefully see what I'm talking about. The first is that protests are integral to processes of state making and state maintaining. Now, this isn't a unique perspective to me, but it's one that doesn't make its way into many of the analyses. This is talked about in feminist IR literature, in a number of the more radical contentious politics, feminist geography, et cetera, anthropology of the state, et cetera. But to look at the Jordan case, Jordan is often portrayed as a case, a country that was invented by the British, who brought the Hashemites from the Hejaz region after the Great Arab Revolt, instilled them in power, built a state, basically crushed any dissent that there was, gave them money, helped build a military, and that's how the state came into being, right? So that's true as far as it goes. But the flip side of the story is people say all these resistance and revolts that came up against this were crushed, right? So therefore they were ineffective because they were crushed and many people died in some instances. But in fact, the way the state institutions emerged are a direct response to who was protesting and where and how. So a major rebellion, the Adwan Rebellion in 1923, sees within months, and this is a rebellion that was put down by the Royal Air Forces from the air, and many people died. Within months, the head of the Adwan Tribal Confederation, Sheikh Majid Adwan, ends up as like the right-hand man of the emir, Abdullah. And his people start getting more jobs in government, and they get more beneficial, situations in terms of administrative apparatuses where investment is happening. So the way the state making unfolded was, in result, a response to who was resisting and who was rebelling. The Bedouin, which we saw, were rebelling. They were rebelling so much that they finally decided to hire them into the army and made them the army. Like, you're gonna cause trouble on the railroad, we'll just hire you to prevent other people from raiding the railroad, right? And that has repercussions up until today, that the Bedouin are still some of the most, strict, harshest of the security forces, very loyal to the regime, right? So the sort of state-making protests aren't peripheral challenges, they're sort of central to what emerges in the state-making period. The second main intervention is protests shape and are shaped by the built environment. So I'm gonna draw this out expansively, so I'm not gonna say too much about it here, except you can't unsee the way protests affect space once you become aware of it. And so I'm hoping to ruin your lives and make you see the physical built environment differently. And certainly we see this in Washington very, very clearly. And the third is that this sort of IR question, these geographies of regional and global entanglement shape the patterns of protest and vice versa. And here we want sort of thinking about different kinds of state projects or different kinds of projects. So a project of the Ottomans to control trade and extract taxes is very different in scope and depth from a colonial state-making project that aims to create control over a whole territory, establish a centralized administration, etc. So I'm looking at protests as these state-making or governance projects evolve over time. And the three empirical observations, Amman, we're going to look at, and the sort of political economy of what it means to create a new capital and what that does to the rest of the country, space and protest in the built environment, and then routine protest. So let's start with Amman. Transjordan in the 19th century was itself a kind of peripheral area. Right, the northern part of this area, you can see the outlines of what becomes the modern state. The northern part of the area basically identifies as part of Greater Syria. They have sort of affective ties and close family connections. Two major urban centers like Damascus, also to Beirut, Palestine, etc. In the south, some parts of this southern area saw themselves as connected to the Hejaz, right? And so they had sort of connections there. In between, if you push them, they would, yeah, we're part of Greater Syria, but we really have independent identities. The Karakis saw themselves as particularly badass in resisting the Ottoman, in Tafila, in Man. So you had these sort of local power structures that weren't just part of Greater Syria or the Hejaz, but they weren't a united unit in any meaningful sense of shared common identity. So Abdullah, as I mentioned, after World War I and the Great Arab Revolt, comes with British support into this area, and he is given by the British, under the British mandate, the task of constructing a state in this area. And he's actually met with different perspectives. So some people are like, finally, an Arab, thank you, like this is good, we can work with this. And I'm a sheikh of a prominent tribal confederation, I'm gonna cozy up to him and see what I can get out of it. And others were very strongly resistant and opposed to it and, fought it entirely or fought to better their position once it was clear he wasn't going away. And this isn't in these sort of like broader tribal coalitions often were divided. So in Man, where he first lands, the Huaytat tribe, which is in that area, are themselves divided on whether to accept him and his rule or not. But he's got to decide where he's going to put a capital now. And the first place he decides is a city in the north called Salt. And he and his entourage go up there after some months, and they're met in Salt by days and days of demonstrations who don't want him there. So an enterprising tribal sheikh of the Bani Sakhr says, hey, why don't you come and settle on our land, not in my town where my center of authority is, but there's this town called Amman. So he's like, come settle in Amman. And Amman is a town that in the 19th century was never even inhabited year round, except until the Ottomans settled Circassians and Chechen refugees there. And then it was settled year round. A few hundred families, maybe 1,000 by the turn of the century. It gets a stop on the Hejaz Railway, and so it has a little more importance. But the key issue is there's no one in Amman that's a local power authority that's going to be challenged by Abdullah being there. It's kind of this peripheral place. But by settling there, it sets around a complete inversion over the course of the next century of the political and economic geography of the country. So whereas that north-south trading route and all those little villages and towns along the way, those were the centers of power, now it's suddenly in Amman. And those areas become increasingly peripheral. Politically, as Amman is the place to go, and economically, and we'll see this in a second, how significant it changes. So within a very short time, a town that had no protests at all now has routine protests that are taking place from the 20s up until today. And the protests in the downtown area, so we see the downtown area, this is the Grand Husseini Mosque over here, and people gather at the Grand Husseini Mosque. And we'll look at another mosque in a minute, but it's really important to recognize it's nothing to do with religion. It's just a landmark, right? And the mosques often have plazas or spaces in front of them, so they're just places people gather, but there's nothing necessarily religious about any of the protests. But the Grand Husseini Mosque becomes a go-to place for protest. And in this early period, a few hundred people could really bring the whole city to a standstill, right? Because all the main government buildings and the commercial area were down in the wadi in the main downtown area. And so you didn't take a lot to bring things to a standstill. Over time, Jordan expands dramatically. Amman grows dramatically. In 1948, it accepts hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who have to flee, and it fundamentally changed the character of the state. Amman's population doubles in a matter of 18 months. So you have this emerging financial urban center that's the center of commerce, trade, as well as government, and these other towns aren't changing a whole lot. They're expanding, but they're still fairly peripheral. But the downtown mosque is still the go-to place for protests. People know this over decades and decades of practice, that this is where there's going to be major protests. And this is one in the downtown area at the Grand Husseini Mosque, where people gather in front of the mosque. They will march for a particular, I think this is my next, they'll march down the road to the municipal center, they'll have speeches at the municipal center, and then they'll go home. So there's a very particular spatial and temporal routine to protests in the downtown area. In fact, it's so routine that even here, they're sometimes kind of boring. So the Muslim Brotherhood, this is a protest of the Muslim Brotherhood's Muslim Brotherhood organized protests downtown, and they have their own parade guards to make sure nothing goes awry, right? So the businesses don't close. Nobody's particularly concerned that these protests are going to be disruptive of anything. And in fact, because the city has expanded so much in all directions, but the main commercial centers and government buildings are all now in West Amman, that it's not disruptive of anything downtown anymore. Hundreds and thousands of people, it just doesn't disrupt anything. So the government is very happy with these kinds of protests. They look large, but they're not disruptive of anything, which is the point here, they're not disruptive. But as Amman has grown, and this is sort of the political economy aspect of it, Amman itself is the financial capital of the country, but it's really also concentrated in just one piece of Amman, what's called West Amman, which is where the sushi bars and the hotels and all the embassies and government offices and commercial centers and malls are predominantly located in West Amman. This is an artist rendering of the Abdali mega project, which I'll talk about again in a moment, that was constructed by forcing a whole neighborhood to evacuate, whether they wanted to or not, and moving a very popular public transportation hub, the Abdali hub, to Tarbabur, which is about 1.5 miles away. So to create this, we've sort of now moved a sort of transit center that the working class people can access out of the way, because it just doesn't look nice. With this has come all kinds of resentment, anger at the government. People, especially in these outlying areas, are frustrated. They see these huge projects happening in the capital, and they're like, what about us? We don't have water. We get water maybe once a week, sometimes 3 or 4 weeks we get water. We don't have water. We don't have infrastructure developments. You're throwing a little projects our way, but all this money is pouring into the capital and into Aqaba and into the resort zone down by the Dead Sea. So there's tremendous resentment and anger. The government's own figures are now over 40% unemployed in the country, and most people think the government figures are considerably low. So this is a serious issue in terms of the sort of political economy of the country right now. But what's interesting about this part of West Amman is it's also some of the places that are most common for people to protest, but they're also places where the government really doesn't want there to be protest. You can protest in out-of-the-way places, but we really don't want things to look bad. And so part of my talk is going to really sort of draw that out. This is the billboard for the Abdali project before it was being built. And it sort of underlines who's left out of this cosmopolitan vision. The website for the Abdali project used to start with a twinkling. It'd say, glitter your life. And the West Amman, you still see all the constructions have these kinds of pictures. So the woman in the paparazzi and the velvet rope and, tossing her hair. So this is what's imagined as this new Jordan, sort of Dubaiization of these projects in the downtown area, that most Jordanians have no access, no hope of possibly accessing these spaces or this kind of lifestyle. And they're mad about it. So in 2019, a number of workers in Aqaba, the port in the south, are frustrated that their weekly protests are getting no response, and they decide they're going to march on the capital, on foot and often barefoot. And this is a completely new repertoire of protest, right? This has never happened before. So they march and they pick up people along the way. When they get into town, they march not to the common protest areas, not to the Grand Husseini Mosque, not to the Prime Ministry, which I'll talk about in a minute. They march to the Royal Court downtown because they're angry at the regime, not the government. They're angry at the regime and they want jobs. And so this first march had about 350 people, and they were there for a couple weeks, and the government would come out and negotiate with them and offered them jobs, and they're like, we don't want crappy jobs. We want good jobs with pensions and healthcare, permanent jobs in industries like phosphate and potash and so on. The problem is these industries have all been privatized. So they're essentially demanding of the government to produce jobs in the private sector. And they do, after 3 weeks, come up with 350 jobs, put everybody on buses, and take them home. So what do you think happens? Everyone starts walking to the capital to get jobs because it works, right? And so they don't all get as good of jobs, but it happens over and over. This was one I took in January of 2020 from this small village called Diban, which is in Madaba district outside of Amman. And I missed them by 1 day, but they left the banners behind. So this isn't something you do. And this is something we do at protests anyways, often. You leave your placards in piles as you leave, and they're doing the same thing. And so these continued up until the pandemic. To my knowledge, they haven't resumed since, but it's possible they have, because if nobody writes about it or none of my friends tell me, you don't see it. And that's one of the things that's striking about my work is I use so many sources that I'm just constantly discovering more and more of these small protests, often 24 people, all over the country. I'm talking about Amman a lot now, but not only in the city. And so they're angry that the economic center is in Amman and they can't access it, and so they're marching to get jobs from these villages. But one of the things the government does in response to these consistent demands is it structures the electoral system in a way to give those outlying areas disproportionate voice in parliament, right? So their constant protesting literally ends up shaping the electoral system. So in some of those areas, in Karak, for example, there's 1 seat for every 3,500 or so people. And in parts of Amman, which is predominantly where in north, you have a large Palestinian population, you have 1 seat for every 30 or 40,000 people. So it's like tenfold difference. And that electoral system is to give voice to these groups that are constantly complaining and protesting and resisting and demanding that they have access to something. So I'm going to transition then, because we're going to pick up on the Amman question, to the space and protest in the built environment. And here, I think it's nice to sort of talk about the cover of my book, which is truncated here, but this is a drawing by an artist and an activist, Laleh Khalili, and it captures exactly what my book is about. So I was super excited when I found this. So in 2018, in May and June, there were protests against taxes that turned into anti-austerity protests. And tens of thousands of people were on the street. They shut down, I mean, all across the country, not just in Amman. All the towns had major protests. They blocked the street. There's moments when Amman is completely cut off because there's so many burning tires and roadblocks. They might only last a day or a few hours, but they're, this is happening. So it's illegal to criticize the king under a bunch of different laws. And so until recently, you basically criticize the prime minister, was the head of government, and that's okay, but you don't criticize the king, because people get arrested for that. Prime Ministry is located on a traffic circle called the Fourth Circle on Zahran Street. So protests at the Fourth Circle are called Fourth Circle protests, right? It's because the prime minister is there. So this was a center where protests were in May and June 2018. And Laleh draws this to capture the following dynamic. So this is a member of the gendarmerie. In Arabic, the gendarmerie is Quwat al-Darak, right? Derrick forces, Darak forces, or this says cute in English, cute Darak. And the boy is hugging it. Basically, at the Fourth Circle, the riot police were very well behaved. The Crown Prince comes down and visits and says, oh, thank you for protecting Jordanians' right to express dissent, and we care about them. There's all these photo ops, etc. And this says at the Fourth, so the Fourth Circle. Down with the rule of the IMF, the World Bank. So these are the common slogans. And this officer is, celebrating the wonderful Derek, the cute Derek. Not far away, like less than a kilometer away, in a neighborhood called Hayat Tefele, same protesters, different protesters, same topic, same slogans, are basically beaten by the riot police. Right, so 24 in a non-visible place are treated different than thousands in the sort of central visible spaces, right? So it captures that sort of difference of policing. So part of the questions of the book is why? How do we understand these differential policings? And in a chapter, on the sort of the built environment, I'm looking at the ways in which protests shape the built environment and the ways in which the built environment shapes protests. So instead of defining all these, I'm just going to go right to the examples because it's easy to see in pictures. Erasures are a very common technique of regimes. They want to get rid of any evidence that a protest existed, right? So here in Bahrain, the Pearl Roundabout, the center in March and April of 2011 of their revolution, has to be disassembled and entirely replaced. The roundabout is actually even replaced, not just that the statue's gone, they make it a perpendicular intersection. And not only that, but this coin in circulation with the Pearl Roundabout on it has to be taken out of circulation because we can't have that symbol anywhere. And for a while, there's a really interesting phenomenon where activists would go around stenciling with spray paint the Pearl Roundabout on buildings overnight, knowing that they were going to be whitewashed in the morning, but they were still like trying to sort of keep that alive. So that symbol was so powerful and the government had to get rid of it. Protest art also has to be eliminated, right? We have to get rid of any evidence that there was an uprising or protest that happened. And typically those places then see flags, national symbols, statues to the military or the police, replacing these to sort of reinscribe a different kind of meaning on spaces that are associated with protests. So I'm calling those erasures. Exposures have to do with the militarization of the built environment. Right, so we're familiar on the right with Paris. After so many revolutions in Paris in the 1860s and early 1870s, they reconstruct Paris, the Haussmannian reconstruction of Paris, that does more than just affect protest. It's about health and creating sewage systems that actually work. But these wide swaths are also as the geographer David Harvey shows, the wide swaths go right to army barracks outside of this town. So it facilitates the movement of troops very quickly into town if there is unrest, right? So you see the city changing in response to try to preventing these protests from existing. On the left is Tahrir Square. People might not realize, but the Khedive Ismail went to Paris and he was like, I want one, and came back and built him Tahrir in direct emulation. What's fascinating about that then is Tahrir is one of the most easily policeable spaces in the city because you can get troops there quickly. However, because it's a large space, if you have a critical mass of people, it becomes then a dramatic sign of gathering, right? So we see that happening. Anyone see Hurt Locker? So this is the opening scene of Hurt Locker. This was filmed on Sumaya Street in Amman. Sumaya Street is a street that slices down the middle of the Wahdat refugee camp. The Wahdat refugee camp did not have a very wide street down the middle of it until after Black September, when the government decided, in Black September, when they were fighting, the armies fighting the Palestinian Fedayeen militias, discovers that it can't get into the refugee camps easily or quickly because of these small, windy streets. Or not winding streets in the camps, but the topography of the country, and the camps didn't have any access in it. So they slashed this street wide down the middle of Wahdat camp, and outside of the camp now, the police station now looks like a fortress or kind of a prison tower where you can literally look down into the camp, right? So again, acts of resistance end up changing the built environment in ways for the state to try to prevent it from happening again. Another kind of exposure in Ferguson, Missouri. Hundreds of trees were cut down after the 2014 Michael Brown protests, which is an extraordinary act of violence on a community. But also the police that would surveil the neighborhood flashing their lights at night were flashing lights into people's homes because now the cover of these trees are gone. So this is a common technique. It's not only a Jordan-specific thing. So exposures. Containment's a familiar one, often on campuses. You can do whatever you want, just don't leave the campus. And campuses are constructed as fortresses with chokeholds very often, gates that you can't get through, and they can prevent you from leaving campus if they want to. That's all intentional. Many campuses in the United States were reconstructed after the anti-war protests in the late 60s and early 70s to have administrative buildings that couldn't be as easily occupied, that were difficult to access, ground floors with windows that don't open for various kinds of reasons. So you see this, there's books written on the campuses. Exclusions, right? Urban planning that's designed to prevent people from being able to access it. So here in the United States, we have the right to free speech, right? First Amendment rights. You do not have the right to exercise your free speech anywhere you want. So the conduct of free speech is highly constrained. You can't protest on government buildings, on military campuses, certain public spaces. The geographer Don Mitchell has written extensively about the privatization of public spaces. So you don't have the right necessarily to protest in privatized public space because it's private space. However, when it's treated like public space, the courts will often step in to decide how much you can protest. And very often those decisions are, as long as you don't disrupt commerce, right? So Abdali Boulevard project is a privatized public space. There are guards to go in. Anyone can go in, but you know when you're welcome or not. And particularly young groups of men are not welcome to come in, and they're often turned back. That's also true at malls and many of the other places. What's really striking about this, and I wish I had a better angle, but far off in the corner, and this is the artist rendering of Abdali Boulevard, underground is a mall called the Abdali Mall, and above it was to be a plaza, a big open plaza. And in 2015, one of the heads of this project told a architect and urban planner, Eliana Abu Hamdi, that they didn't build the plaza because they were afraid people would protest there. So they literally stop part of the production and don't put this public space out because they're worried that people are going to protest on it. So this is another area that's shaped by protests in ways that are not expected. Enclosures are sort of closing off spaces so you can't ever get access to them. On the top right, in March of 2011, Jordan's largest and most contentious protest was this sort of March 24th youth protest, took place at the Interior Ministry traffic circle. And this is the fourth circle where the Prime Ministry office is located. In both of those cases, in 2014, 2015, the government fenced off those areas and put in a lot of landscaping, basically rendering them not accessible as places to gather. Right? And so the fourth circle, you can see here, this used to be an open plaza in the middle. Before, let me go forward. This is a picture from the fourth circle as well. The fourth circle used to be an intersection. Even though it was called the circle, it was befuddling because it was just a perpendicular intersection until they made it into a traffic circle. And protesters would go there, particularly in the 90s, and there were protesters over women's rights, but also protests over press freedoms and any number of issues. And they'll go into the fourth circle and you could clog traffic. So again, downtown is not disruptive, so they found a new way to be disruptive at the fourth circle by clogging traffic. And there was a lot of traffic. And so the government, nothing to do with the protests, completely unrelated, to ease traffic, built all these underpasses along the traffic circles. And the fourth circle actually becomes a circle, first with the pedestrian plaza, but then of course, as I showed you, the plaza gets shut off. This is me looking down, and so if you protest up there, the bulk of the traffic going by is never going to see you. You're not going to slow them down, you're not going to be visible. Only people on the top are going to be visible. And what's interesting about this in terms of militarization, these tunnels are weird because it's not quite 2 lanes, but it's kind of big for 1 lane. And that's designed so that armored vehicles can move easily through them. Right? And so you see, even though this wasn't intended for a militarized purpose, it facilitates the movement of armed vehicles if necessary. All across Amman, but particularly where there's protests, you have random barricades that appear for no particular reason. There's no construction going on. They're just sort of suddenly it's closed off. They don't only happen around protests, but they frequently do happen around protests. They'll just cut off the street so people can't get to that area to see the protests at all. So that way is a way of isolating protesters. And then about this, in the after these major protests in 2018 that I talked about, the government decided no more fourth circle protests. You can now protest down the hill at this parking lot. So I was there in April of 2019 at a protest. They had a Facebook page. All the activist protests have Facebook pages that announce where they're going to be, so you can, see them. And at the fourth circle. So I'm at the fourth circle, supposed to start at 6 o'clock. There's a bunch of armored vehicles and police there, and nobody's there. So I called my friend. I'm like, dude, where are you? He's like, we're at the fourth circle. I'm like, I'm at the fourth circle and standing in front of the I don't know where you're at. They're like, oh, no, the fourth circle isn't at the fourth circle anymore. It's in this parking lot. So there's fourth circle protests. End up down the hill in this parking lot instead of at the top of the hill. But even that becomes kind of contentious. They try to control it. And so this is again, the fourth circle protest. This is in the November 2018, and these are the Bedia, the Bedouin, very badass, willing to bash heads police, not so well behaved as the Darek, trying to prevent activists from getting to the parking lot. So really, really don't want the protest to be taking place there. This is a protest in the parking lot. This is the one that I did finally go to, the fourth circle one. This was on the 30th anniversary of the Hebet Nissan protests in 1989 that led to the sort of lifting of martial law and opening of the political system. But you can see also here, there's pedestrian overpass where they can sort of look down on protesters. Again, the police forces are usually three sides. They usually leave one side open so you can come and go and move within this. There's, I think, 24 protesters, people actually protesting here, and again, hundreds of police. And it's in a parking lot. It's not blocking traffic. But even this is too much. So this 10-foot concrete wall went up in 2021 around the Fourth Circle protest site to serve absolutely no purpose, right? It's not blocking anything off, except to render anything that happens in there not visible to anyone else. And so you see across Amman all these sort of techniques for closing off spaces and making things less visible, making it harder for people to gather. In front of the parliament, a big parking lot near the Fourth Circle where they used to gather. That has a fence around it. And so you see this sort of cat and mouse trying to close them down, and the people try to find new spaces to protest. This is the Hashemite Plaza downtown, which is where the workers' sit-ins would be. This is now gated, and it's also not open 24 hours a day anymore, so officially camping out is now illegal in that spot, right? So there's ways in which, and you can't cut across the plaza in whichever way you want. You have to go in certain entrances and exits. Again, this isn't a technique specific to Jordan. This is a technique that happens globally. There were Tompkins Square Park in the East Village in New York City was reconstructed after 1988 police riots to do this, to cut it off. It's not open 24 hours a day. There's no big areas for gathering anymore, specifically to try to diminish the potential impact of protests in that spot. So my last of my 3 empirical examples, the political effect of routine protests. So here we're going to look at protests at the Khalili Mosque. Again, it's nothing to do with the mosque. It just happens to be a convenient place to have protests. And the protests there are so routine that they're pretty boring, right? You know what everybody, it's almost like everybody's on a script, where you go and where you stand. And so I'm asking, what's the point of protests like this? Why do protesters engage in protests that seem, there's no chance you're going to cancel the peace treaty with Israel. You're not going to accomplish that. So why go through all this? These protests start with the Second Intifada in 2000, where people are gathering in this newly constructed area, in part because there's a huge field over here to gather in. So people are gathering there, and it's about less than a kilometer to the Israeli embassy. So they gathered there to protest it because it was the biggest open space in proximity to the Israeli embassy. And at that point, they were like, we're going to march on the Israeli embassy. And the police blocked every street possible. They were desperate to protect people from getting there. And they went on for months, weekly for months. So over time, fewer and fewer people came out, but a core of activists continued to do this. So they continued these march on the Israeli embassies, but they stopped actually trying to get to the Israeli embassies. And this is where it became routine. They're sort of performing this march on the Israeli embassy symbolically, but never actually doing it. So I took all these pictures, which will become important in a second when you see what's going on. Here I'm approaching a protest. This whole line of people in the back are just bystanders watching what's happening. This is the Khalili Mosque. You see the TV truck is there waiting for protesters to arrive, for something to happen. And we're just kind of hanging out. The riot police are here. This is the Darak forces, armored vehicles. I think there were 16 of them there that day, so it's very heavy show of force. And here they're just sort of lining up on the side of the street. So the street goes this way. The protesters are here, and the riot police are here. And they're not getting in the street, even though they're protesting, because they're going to wait for the protesters to get in the street to symbolically march up, and then they'll line up to block the street, again, symbolically. Here I am in the middle of the protest. This is a very diverse group. Remember when I was talking about the Muslim Brotherhood protests downtown with thousands of people, but they have their parade guards to make sure everything's, nothing goes wrong? They sent photographers to take pictures of all those, and then they put them in the Islamist newspaper, As-Sabil, and they're like, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic Action Front are standing up to the regime and demanding the end of the peace treaty and, representing people, etc. And it looks like these huge protests, because they are huge. Similarly, at these protests, they always show up with a photographer and take photos that appear in their papers the next day, but they leave before anybody ever gets in the street, right? They're there for the photo op, to perform their relevance and have evidence that they're doing something contentious, but they're desperate to not actually be contentious. And so their flags will be disappearing here. Here they're beginning to line up across the street. Again, I'm just walking up taking pictures of the riot police. In many non-democratic countries, that would be a very bad idea, right? But there's nothing to it here in these protests. It's not saying all protests, but these protests. And again, I went to, I think 15 or 16 of the Khalili protest alone. It's always the same thing. This is in the middle of the protest. You can kind of go in and out. People are in the street now. There's tons of photographers standing waiting for something to happen or nothing to happen. And you can see here, the sidewalks aren't even blocked, because they don't want to inconvenience pedestrians who actually want to move up and down the street. So you can walk up and down the street, but the protesters aren't actually trying to get up the street. They're just going to be in the middle of the intersection. here I am just walking around the riot police, taking pictures. Here I am in the protest. This is a common thing that happens. And again, this is not specific to Jordan, but often women will be at the front of protests, particularly if there's a lot of media there, because you're kind of daring there to be confrontation that gets caught on film, and then it looks really bad. And this was an innovation at this particular protest. This was in 2009. This was the first seeing of the plainclothes people showing up at protests that are clearly coordinating with the dark uniformed officials. And we don't know if they're, some people say they're taken out of prisons, give release if they come do this. Others, they're off-duty police officers, which certainly could be the case by their aesthetic style and haircuts. But we don't know. What we do know is they're clearly coordinating with the uniformed police officers. And in this case, what they're going to do is line up in front of the police to be between the riot police and the protesters, so there can actually be some violence towards protesters that's plausibly not state violence, right? It didn't get particularly bad this day, but on some days there's a lot of pushing. These guys are quite willing. And you can see from all of the pictures, nobody's paying any mind to me until this one guy, who is very unhappy that I was right up in his face taking pictures, right? And he's really glaring at me. The officers didn't care at all. Everybody, it was completely normal, but this guy was very much not having it. So what political work do routine protests do that have no chance of accomplishing what they're actually supposedly trying to accomplish? First, there are occasions to signal commitments to your members or followers. This is what the Muslim Brotherhood's doing, right? It's getting these photo ops where it can then go narrate itself as being particularly, willing to challenge the regime. Protesters argued that it also keeps political spaces open. They're like, if we stop protesting here, because it's only, 50 of us, the government might not let us restart. They might, when we show up in a year or two from now, completely disperse our crowd. So they want to keep these protest spaces open. And particularly the known spaces. The Khalili Mosque protests are only about Israel-Palestine. Nothing else takes place there. Downtown protests, Fourth Circle, any number of topics. But the Khalili ones are only about Israel-Palestine. So if there's something you want to protest about Israel-Palestine, you know where to go, right? That's the go-to place that everyone will, they'll protest elsewhere as well, but this is the go-to place for those protests. And they routine protests also work for you to gain information, for activists to gauge their numbers and who's coming out, the state regime's willingness. So the emergence of the Baltijia in this place signal the government maybe is not going to let us keep doing this and they don't want us to keep doing this. Certainly governments can see if it's 50 people showing up and then it's 100 and then it's 500. That's important information, so the government can gain something from that as well. And this is one of the instances where I argue that by adhering to these routines, you're not really challenging the government in any kind of way. And by falling in line with what the government wants you to do, you're helping to reproduce state power by adhering to the boundaries that the state wants to give for you. And this is the mosque at the field at the Khalili Mosque is now fenced off, so you can't gather there anymore either. During the Sheikh Jarrah protests a year and a half ago, people did gather at the Khalili Mosque, but they gathered in other places because this fence wasn't there. And this lot is for sale, or for rent. If you'd like to rent a rocky lot with weeds on it, you can. I don't know why you would rent a lot like that, but there it is. It's not available. So we're seeing that exclusion as a way to prevent people from being able to gather there. So I'll stop there. I hope I sort of illustrated some different ways of thinking about protests and how they not only telling us about protests per se, but about some big questions of political economy, of state building, of power, repression, resistance, etc. And I look forward to your comments and questions. So thank you.